The prophets have been foretelling for years the great revival coming to America in ways it has never been seen before. Have we reached the fullness of times? Do all the pieces to the puzzle of prophecies old and new finally connect? What is God's agenda for America? Let's go on a prophetic journey and find out. What is God's agenda for America? Notice I didn't ask, what's God's agenda for your life? I think if we're honest with ourselves, we tend to be quite diligent in seeking God for direction and purpose in our own lives. But we will rarely ask Him how we can partner with His. Now, to be fair, I never really asked the question myself, not that I can remember anyway. And it's not that I didn't care per se, I just never realized how narcissistic I was. In my mind, God's will for me related to my lives. Simple enough, but naive now that God has expanded my vision. And that might just be the underestimate of the century. I'd been a believer for 20 years when one day, out of the blue, I had an epiphany. In a flash, two stories from the Bible came to remembrance. The story of the Israelites crossing the Jordan River, and the story of Jesus calling Peter to step on the water. And just like that, it hit me. Now, I'm going to need to give you some context first. I had prayed almost 3 years earlier, Jesus, I'm ready to come into the greater purpose you have for me. You just open the door, and I'll quit my job, sell my house, I'll go where you send me. The preparation that took me from that point to this point is for another time. The significant point is this. At the moment of this revelation, the connection could not have been clearer. God was not going to cause my Jordan River to turn into solid ground until I took the first step. Put another way, He was not going to bring me into my promised land until I quit my job first. Now, when I had the epiphany, it's not that I didn't already have a purpose for quitting my job in mind. I'd already started to write my second book. The vision was to write the most thorough, the most realistic depiction of the Christian life ever written, from the point of one's call to the point of God fulfilling His promise. Ambitious, I know. Essentially, the book was a modern-day story of Abraham during his 25 years of waiting. The good, the bad, the ugly, and everything in between. So when I finally sent off my resignation email 3 months later, I sealed the deal of my 13-year, 6th grade teaching career with the following prayer. Jesus, by sending this email, I'm believing that I'm splitting the Jordan River that will take me into my promised land. The next job I enter into is going to be full-time ministry. And then I began to write. That's the backdrop. Months later, I felt compelled to honor a friend visiting from out of town by going with him to the Getty Museum. He was the first to tell me about Trump's success with the economy. The next day, another friend shared something about deep state, which I mentioned to another friend, who sent me a couple other links, which led me on a deeper search still. Then, on August 21st, Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, pleaded guilty to 8 counts, including that of paying off 2 women to keep them quiet about the affairs they were ready to go public with before the election. At the same time, news broke that Paul Manafort, chairman of Trump's campaign, faced 18 charges of bank and tax fraud. Upon hearing that, a word welled up in my spirit. For the first time in my life, God spoke to me, not about my life or that of another person. Rather, He pulled back the veil and showed me His plans on a larger scale. On August 22, 2018, the following words etched out of my pen. Just as Trump and his plans seem to be surrounded, just as impeachment seems more inevitable now than ever, God says, watch me now crash the Red Sea upon this great army that pursues me, and let this serve as a sign to my body. I am coming in power, but the enemy is about to be served. I have allowed him to set the gallows so that I can reverse the curse and hang him on the very gallows he has set for this great nation and for my people. 10 days later, I'd written a 26-page research paper called What is God's Agenda for America?, chronicling the prophecies of more than 50 individuals concerning America, the next Great Awakening, and yes, God's plan for a president, Donald Trump. For the last 2 years since, I have been consumed with the vision. In fact, the prophecies that I have added since I published God's Agenda on September 9th, 2018, have now surpassed everything I had up to that point. And now, almost 2 years later, having just passed through a global pandemic of biblical proportion in a season of protests and riots like this nation has arguably never seen. I have never felt such an urgency to get this work out as now. Over the next 15 videos or so, I am going to build the prophetic storyline in a fashion that parallels the vision shared by many. For decades, prophets have seen a great awakening coming in the form of a wave or a tsunami. Just as a tsunami looks small in the distance but then builds in height as it approaches the coast, so I start back in the 1930s with words of the coming revival and build the prophetic frequency as we get closer to the present day. So buckle your seatbelt and enjoy the show, because there's a massive wave coming your way. I started all the way back in 1939 with the great healing revivalist Smith Wigglesworth, who reportedly raised as many as 14 people from the dead. Holy smokes, I know, right? As his friend Lester Sumrall reports, he had been asked by the British government to leave the outbreak of World War II and stop by Wigglesworth House to say his final farewell when Wigglesworth got caught up in a vision. "I see revival coming to planet Earth as never before," he said. "It will be untold numbers that will be saved. No man will be able to say this many or that many, because nobody will be able to count the number of souls that get saved. Cancer will be healed, the dead will be raised, and no disease will be able to stand before God's people. It will be worldwide." He then opened his eyes, turned to Lester, and exclaimed, "I will not see this, but you will." Lester did not. He instead died in 1996. Wigglesworth saw in part, but he did not see in full. Now, before going any further, I feel the need to start with a disclaimer. Scripture says we see in part, we know in part. For the sake of time and efficiency, I am not going to read every prophecy in its fullness. In fact, some parts hit the mark more than others. Some parts of prophecy are just too early to judge, and some parts have already been proven false. Lester Sumrall did not see the revival, but that does not mean that what Wigglesworth saw was not from God. One consistent theme you will see with prophecy: it will almost always be fulfilled later than you think. In 1956, Lauren Cunningham, who later gave birth to the global youth movement called YWAM, or Youth with a Mission, had a vision of a map in which he saw waves on the shorelines of the continents growing bigger and bigger, covering the landmass. The waves then turned to youth that would sweep over the globe in a massive missionary movement. Despite more than 180 nations that have been impacted since YWAM's inception, the story is not yet finished. In 1963, another legend of the faith, Kenneth Hagin, saw a similar vision but with different imagery. He said, "I was caught up in the air with the Lord, and I looked down and saw a map of the United States. And the Lord said, 'Behold, son, I shall show you that which shall come to pass.' He then saw falling upon the earth a ball of fire from heaven, and it divided into small sparks and fell upon men. Then I saw an army of men rise up. Before the worst shall come, and the day of darkness encompasses, there will be those who shall go and who shall carry the fullness of my truth in the fire to the states and to the nations abroad. For there is a work that must be done spiritually before the Lord shall come." Another disclaimer here. Kenneth Hagin seems to be referring to two distinct events: a massive revival and the second coming of Jesus. Over the next 15 videos, I will not be discussing the second coming because I believe there is a substantial great awakening that will precede it. Throughout history, people have projected when that would come and what that would look like. I don't plan to join that long list of false prognosticators, but when ample revelation allows, I do hope to touch on that in a future video. Because rest assured, all that we speak about in the coming videos is paving the way for the main event, whenever that shall come. Next, we jump to 1975, when the late Bob Jones died and went to heaven. Before being revived, God showed him a myriad of events that would come to pass in the years ahead, all of which have played out just as God showed him. These things were said to precede an end times harvest that would see the salvation of over 1 billion youth. 2 years later, in 1977, God showed Bob that the church would enter into 40 years of wilderness before he would begin to restore the church, adding that when the glory returns, it will never leave again. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. If you add 40 years to 1977, you get 2017. That was 3 years ago. I'm pretty sure God's glory didn't fill the earth 3 years ago. Well, yes and no. God's ways are not our ways, and if the statement offends your intellect, well, get in line. It's going to get a lot more offensive still. I have an important question to ask you, though, one that's going to guide you throughout the entire video series. What happened in 2017 that had the power to dramatically change the course of human history? Do you need more time? The answer is Donald Trump took office. What? Blasphemy! I know what you're thinking. Trust me, I get it, because I had someone tell me those exact same words. And to be fair, before God began to take me on this journey in 2018, I thought the man was a horse's ass myself. In fact, I used those exact words on several occasions. Moreover, back in November 2016, I couldn't bring myself to vote for Trump or Hillary Clinton. I thought, they're both miserable. What difference does it make? Well, as I've come to learn, quite a lot of difference. I've since come to realize that America's choice to pick Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton, by as slim a margin as it may have been, could go down as one of the best decisions this nation has ever made. If that sounds insane, stay tuned. Oh, and one more note, Bob Jones referred to the salvation of 1 billion youth. For the sake of practical planning, what would that look like? If the prophecy Bob Jones had in 1875 came to pass, and half of those were saved in evangelistic crusades, and 20,000 people got saved per meeting, it would require 10 meetings worldwide every day for 7 years. Here's another equation. It would be 1,000 people getting saved in 200 different countries every day for 7 years. You're going to want to pay extra attention to this next one. In 1986, Dave Wilkerson gave this prophecy. I see a plague coming to the world, and the bars, churches, and government will shut down. The plague will hit New York City and shake it like it has never been shaken. The plague is going to force prayerless believers into radical prayer and into the Bibles, and repentance will be the cry of the man of God in the pulpit. And out of it will come the third great awakening that will sweep through America and the world at large. Sound familiar? Could Wilkerson's prophecy be the lead domino that triggers all the rest, including the second part of his own prophecy? We shall soon see. A year later, in 1987, Rick Joyner was himself given an extensive vision of the coming harvest. He was shown 2 great waves of harvest coming. The first, he said, emerged a couple of years after the vision, resulting in the greatest ingathering and growth of Christianity in history. Joyner was predominantly referring to 2 major revivals that saw millions of people from all over the world flood into their churches to be saved, healed, and spiritually awakened. The first was the Toronto Outpouring, which started in January 1994, and the second was the Pensacola, Florida revival, which started the next year on Father's Day in 1995. Joyner then explains that he saw a period of stillness after the first wave receded. That interlude, the Lord told him, was meant to prepare the church for the next wave to follow, one far bigger than the one that preceded it. Joyner added on June 9, 2018, some 30 years after the original vision, "We are on the verge of one of the greatest events in all of history, and the greatest ingathering of new believers that there has ever been." The first 5 men have now passed. The 6th man, Rick Joyner, I had the privilege to chauffeur for one weekend in which he served as a guest speaker for my church. But the last contributors to this first video are 2 men I once knew well. Between 1998 and 2005, I attended Harvest Rock Church, pastored by Che Ahn and Lou Engle in Pasadena, California. I remember Che sharing on several occasions the dream he had in 1982, in which he saw an African-American man waving to him and saying, "Come to Los Angeles, for there's going to be a great revival." 2 years later, Che and his family, and Lou Engle and his family, hopped in their cars and drove from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles. Little did Lou know at the time that in 2000 he would launch a stadium prayer movement named The Call that would start with 400,000 people gathering at the National Mall in the very city he left 18 years earlier. Little did Che know that he would one day become the founder of Harvest International Ministries, an apostolic movement with churches and ministries in more than 60 nations worldwide. During the 1990s, Lou had a series of events that would brand him as the father for the revival Che's dream spoke about. One day, while reading the book Azusa Street by Frank Bartleman, he vehemently cried for the mantle of the man that co-led the 1906 revival and sparked a worldwide movement. The next day, a friend came to him and said, "I had a dream last night. I saw a book titled Revival with Frank Bartleman's face on the inside cover, and then Lou, his face turned to yours." On another occasion, Lou woke up with a dream that referenced two books he needed to read. The first was called Rain from Heaven by Arthur Wallis, and the second was called Shaping History Through Prayer and Fasting by Derek Prince. Later that night, before a speaking engagement, Lou sat in the office with Pastor Joe Sweet. Without mentioning any of this, Joe pulled the book Rain from Heaven off his bookshelf and said, "I think you're looking for this." The very next morning, while teaching a prophetic class, a student walked in and said, "This morning I was at Anaheim Vineyard and a man shouted out, 'I know you're going to see Lou Engle today. Please give him this book for me.'" The book was called Shaping History Through Prayer and Fasting. Now you tell me, what's the probability of that? Those two books led Lou on a lifestyle of fasting and prayer that eventually led to the call, in houses of prayer and massive prayer movements all around the country. Many years later, and too many other prophetic confirmations to count, Lou and three friends went to the woods for 40 days of fasting and prayer. The night before, he had a dream that his stomach was being operated on. When he awoke, he had this thought: does God want to operate on my appetite to make me a modern-day Daniel for the shifting of history? Then, halfway through the fast, the prophetic intercessor contacted him with his own dream in which Lou was fasting and 5 angels came into the room, operating on his stomach, took the book of Daniel, lit it on fire, and sealed it to his belly. Now, Daniel, like Frank Bartleman, was a man who recognized the times and seasons. The prophet Jeremiah had foretold that the Jewish people would serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. In Jeremiah 29:11, we read that the prophecy also declared that at the end of those 70 years, the people would return to Jerusalem. Then we see King Cyrus fulfill the prophecy when he invites the Jews to return to rebuild the temple. He is unique in that he was decreed by name in Isaiah 44 and 45 to return God's people to Israel more than 100 years before his birth. Now, as outlandish as it may sound to bring Donald Trump into the conversation of biblical prophecy, the world saw a miracle when Israel was recognized as a nation on May 14, 1948, after more than 2,000 years of disbandment. Now that takes on more significance when you consider that Trump moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem on May 16, 2018. I ask again, how many years were the people of Israel in captivity? 70 years. How many years separate Israel's rebirth and the United States moving its embassy back to Jerusalem? The answer is 70 years to the very week. Yeah, that would seem to be significant. More on that later. Oh, and one more interesting note about the end of 70 years of captivity that Jeremiah prophesied about. On the day of Donald Trump's inauguration, he was 70 years, 7 months, and 7 days old. I'm not making this up, just reporting the facts. You can draw your own conclusions. All right, consider that a warm-up. If you think that collection of prophecies is substantial, you haven't seen nothing yet. For our second video, we leapfrogged to 2007 for the foundational Trump prophecy. The first of a list of prophecies that now arguably far exceeds 100, believe it or not. Yes, I said far exceeds 100. And you won't want to miss this. Within this one prophecy are 7 distinct markers that point to this very crossroads of time we now stand at today. Thanks for joining me for part 1 of What is God's Agenda for America? I invite you to come along for the journey. Our next stop is video number 2. Trump will become a trumpet, the original Trump prophecy. What is God's agenda for America? Come on, let's find out together. This is the first podcast of a 17-video series. Subsequent podcasts will be released weekly until early September, when I start releasing 2 to 3 videos a week as we get closer to the election. Press the subscribe button to be alerted when new podcasts are released.